It's a great pleasure to be here. This is the project Steve was talking about. It's called Pasture Promise TV. We've got some leaflets about it over there. We also got on DVD some copies of the first film we made, which is on pasture-based dairy farming. I'm afraid there won't be enough there for everybody. But these are free for anyone who's interested in dairy farming. Please pick one up. I've been a farming journalist. Well, I did agriculture back in the 60s at university, and then after working on a few farms, I went to work for Farmers Weekly. I've kind of been writing about farming ever since, and there have been enormous changes, as you can imagine, in that time. And I want to talk something about the implications of those changes, the kind of agriculture they produce, the kind of foods and diet they produce, and why I think we're going to need to change them as we go into the new world, which we all know about with all its uncertainties. So this is the kind of agriculture that we're all led to believe is going to feed the planet. I suppose you could describe it as it's based on a handful of grains which are grown from hybrid seeds and perhaps GM seeds in due course. They have a lot of inputs, so it's kind of the green revolution system of farming. It's almost become a legend or a myth, if you like, that this is a very productive form of agriculture. And in some senses it is, but there are some downsides. Along with this kind of agriculture, we have a particular kind of food, processed foods basically, particularly processed carbohydrates. That kind of agriculture produces an awful lot of starchy foods. And the aim really is to produce it at as low a price as possible, because it's going to be further processed before we eat it. And in our case it's wheat, but there are many other crops around the world which you know about and dealt with in the same way. I mean, the classic one in the States is corn. You know, the average American I read in that book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, I forget the figures, but the average American eats, I don't know, a couple of hundredweight of corn every year. And people say, well, I never eat sweet corn, so I can't be. But of course, corn is in about 20,000, maize, as we know, is in about 20,000 food products. And we do very much the same with wheat. We grow in this country 16 or 17 million tonnes of wheat a year. A quarter of it, not a quarter of it, 40% of it goes into foods for human consumption. This kind of foods, bread, refined cereals, these kind of foods. 40% of it goes as animal feeds, mostly to pigs and poultry, but an increasing, a significant amount to ruminants. And the other 20% is what we used to call the exportable surplus, but now is increasingly being directed towards biofuels, or it was before the cereal price took off a year or two ago. There are consequences to this kind of farming. I don't know whether any of you know this report. You can find it online. It came out about 3 years ago, 2008. It's known as the ISTAD report, and it was a very comprehensive report into food technologies around the world. It involved 400 scientists, experts in all kinds of aspects of agriculture. And they studied agricultural technology around the globe, and they came up with certain conclusions. And just summarising these, they accepted that this kind of food production does indeed produce a large amount of food energy. It has greatly increased the world's production of food energy, starch if you like. But the downsides, there are lots of downsides. Some of the principal ones are the benefits have been very unequal, and sub-Saharan Africa people are still poor, still as hungry as before the Green Revolution. The emphasis on yields has damaged sustainability. I mean, soils are being damaged by this kind of production system around the world, and there are some figures in this report. 1.9 billion hectares of land are degraded, affecting 2.6 billion people. And maybe an even more shocking statistic is that something like 70% of the fresh water extracted around the world goes to irrigate crops. And this at a time when large numbers of people live in water-scarce areas. And of course, it has a heavy reliance on fossil energy, fossil fuels, pesticides, and the fertilisers that go to produce those great yields. It produces unhealthy diets, but I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. But that's the kind of food it produces. And it also produces animal production systems that puts animals in sheds and feeds them. Well, if it's dairy farm, it would be something like TMR, total mixed rations, where you buy these high energy foods, you buy high protein foods, and mix them with home produced forage and feed them in that way. This report concluded that what we need to build for the future are more resilient farming systems. And rather than this kind of monoculture that that our present food systems are based on, we need polycultures. We need more diverse farming systems that are locally adapted to local soils, local conditions, local labour, and local skills. It says food systems that produce enough and healthy food create vibrant communities and fair economies, reduce climate change and sustain the planet, and all those are possible. And it talks about the need to look at agriculture as multifunctional. So it's not just producing large amounts of starch and emptying the countryside of people and depending more and more on fossil fuels. It's actually using people who are there and the skills they have and giving jobs to people. I mean, we're facing, on a global level, coming up to, so we can project there will be 2 billion unemployed people. So there seems no sense in many parts of the world of just emptying the countryside as we've done here. So from that, the kind of food production recommended in this and the politics of this is very strange at the moment. Just a word about the politics. You all have heard of the government foresight report with John Beddington. Well, this is more comprehensive than the foresight study, and on a global level involved a lot more scientists. And I went to a talk by one of the co-authors of this, a chap called Professor Hans Herring, who's very angry that so many countries, this was funded by the World Bank, was supported by about 30 countries, all the UN agencies paid for and supported this, and yet it's now being marginalised. And the reason is, in my view, is that it didn't suggest there was much of an important place in the future for new technologies, and particularly GM. And this upset many of the commercial interests in agriculture, particularly in America, where they see GM as changing everything, really extending this kind of system. And so everyone now got behind this foresight report, which talks about sustainable intensification. A meaningless piece of jargon, but which leaves the door open for GM crops. And now the NFU and our government, and everyone's getting behind it with the backing of the global polynational companies. So, but what that report called for was this more diverse agriculture. And I want to look at what that would mean in Britain, actually, and particularly in relation to the need to put grassland back into our crop rotations. Now, I'm old enough to remember the days when Britain's agriculture was based on the mixed farm. And I guess you all know what this is. You have a rotation of crops, but the key thing is that somewhere in that rotation you have grassland. And you have grassland which is stocked with grazing animals. And the first farm I worked on in the Thames Valley, it was quite a big farm back in the late 1960s, had a dairy farm and also had a lot of arable. And the grassland that grazed the dairy herd sort of followed, went round in the rotation on that farm. And there were lots of benefits to this kind of system, but the key benefit is it returns fertility to the soil. That kind of returning, having grazing animals and all for the manure that goes on the soil, and there's something about grazing which I'll talk about in a minute, but that kind of rotation of grassland and grazing animals actually builds fertility of the soil, builds soil life. And it actually means that you can be very productive without these fossil fuel fertiliser and chemical inputs. And it also produces very healthy foods. Where I live on Exmoor now, and the traditional way of producing beef on Exmoor was actually based on the red, the North Devon, the red ruby. breed of cow, very fine beef animal, and they would just turn these animals, sometimes these animals were crossed with shorthorn to produce a milking animal, but if they were for beef, they would just turn these red rubies or red ruby crosses onto this unimproved moorland grazing, which would have all kinds of deep-rooting herbs and clovers in it. And they would just stay there for 3 or 4 years, and that was your meat. And over the last 10 years, the scientific evidence has accumulated that that is actually the very healthiest kind of meat you can eat. It's now hideously expensive because our subsidised grain system has actually made that kind of farming uneconomic. I could have added that, you know, the commercial impetus to this kind of high input farming means that both America and Europe have subsidised that kind of production for 30 years now, which has made this grain over 30 years cheap enough to actually displace and make uneconomic those very healthy grazing systems. And there was a food programme, I don't know if anyone who listens to the food programme, there was one on, about a year ago, it was on sheep actually, it was on, they had a meat buyer called Lidgate, I think it's Richard Lidgate, but he buys meat, he's got his own high quality butcher shop in London, but he also buys meat for top restaurants and hotels. And he was on this farm in Wiltshire, and he was looking at the lamb and tasting the lamb with the farmer. And he said this is the finest lamb he'd ever tasted. And also in the programme they had Nigel Scollin, who's Professor Nigel Scollin, who's at IBERS in Aberystwyth, who's done a lot of research on the health characteristics of the fats in those kind of grass-fed. And he said not only is it the best tasting meat, but it's actually the healthiest meat you could buy. So these are lambs that are grazed. But the interesting thing was, these lambs were not from, you know, current popular breeds like the Texel or the Beltex or mules. They were actually from a primitive breed of sheep called the Manx Loxton. And they weren't grazing the kind of perennial ryegrass monocultures that are so popular with farmers at the moment. They were grazing unimproved Wiltshire downland. So that kind of very traditional grazing pattern actually produces a very high quality and a very healthy meat. And it's interesting that most of the meat, certainly most of the beef that you buy in a supermarket is actually bought according to 2 criteria, and that's conformation, which is the shape of the animal, and also the fat cover. And neither of those bears any relation either to the flavour of the meat or to the healthy properties, the health-giving properties, the nutrients in the meat. I mean, the reason why this pasture-fed meat is so good for you is because it has a very healthy balance of fat, it has more of these omega-3s that you hear about, has more antioxidants like vitamin E, and it has omega-6 fatty acid you may have heard of called CLA, conjugated linoleic acid, which is a very powerful anti-cancer substance, which you only get in meat and milk from animals grazing grass. And if you feed them significant quantities of grain, that substance disappears from the food. So these traditional ways of producing meat that people in this country have eaten, the kind of meat that people have eaten for centuries, actually protected health, and the same for the dairy foods. Some work at Aberdeen University that shows that omega-3 levels on organic milk were on average 30% higher than conventionally produced milk. But the key thing is the differences were far greater in the summer, and that's because you know, organic farmers have to graze their animals. A higher percentage of the milk, the feed has to come from grass and forage. And that isn't the case with conventional milk, so the difference is the health improvement in the organic milk was during the summer months when the cows were grazing, they were out on grass. And another interesting fact is some work done at Northweek down in the southwest here a few years ago. They actually looked at the health properties, particularly in relation to this substance CLA, which is such a key nutrient in foods. And they found that while all grassland enriches dairy foods and meat with CLA, the levels are even higher when you have plants like dandelion, knapweed, cat's ear, oxeye daisy, plantain, rough hawkbit, self-hill, birdsfoot trefoil, clover, sorrel and yarrow. When those plants, which after all the traditional plants of unimproved grassland, when they're in the grassland this substance is boosted in the foods. So we've gone away, we've gone over to a grain-fed system which is actually, I would suggest, doing a lot of damage, and it's actually degraded the meat that we all eat and buy. I'm going to talk a little bit about what constitutes a healthy food. Some of this might seem new, or maybe it isn't, or it may seem a little controversial, but it's where I've come to in sort of looking at food and farming for about 30 years. I met a few years ago when I was researching my book, We Want Real Food, I met a woman called Sally Fallon, who's a nutritionist based in Washington, DC. And she founded and runs an organisation called the Western Price Foundation, which is challenging all the accepted dogma about what constitutes healthy food. I remember at the Royal Show, I was talking to someone on the organic stand at the Royal Show, and I said I was researching this book. I'd done a book on intensive agriculture and how it damages the environment, and I thought I'd do one on food, intensive agriculture and why it's not good for food. And they said, well, you must, did I know about Sally Fallon? I never heard of her, but I went home and Googled her in the Western Price Foundation, and this was my home in Somerset. She's based in Washington, DC, and I discovered when I looked at her diary, she was actually giving a talk in Somerset, not 20 miles from where I lived the following week. So I knew I was destined to meet her, so I signed up, got a ticket for her, and spent the day at a workshop of hers. And she outlined what the Western Price view about healthy diet is. Now, Western Price, the foundation was named after an American dentist called Western Price, who practiced in Cleveland, Ohio in the early 1920s. And he was the first generation of dentists, medics, if you like, to have patients who were on what he called industrial foods. And by that I mean refined carbohydrates, white flour, margarine. Teeth were much more liable to get TB. So he was a very well-known dentist, very successful practice. He was head of the American Dental Association. He gave it all up at the end of the 1920s. He spent 10 years with his wife travelling around the world to very remote peoples all over the world where they hadn't yet been introduced to these Western industrial foods. So we went to Inuit people in the Arctic Circle, we went to several peoples in Africa, we went to hunter-gatherers in North America and so on. He went to a valley in Switzerland where, until the railways came, in the early 1920s, there was no way into this valley except over a high mountain pass. So all the people that lived in this valley could only eat basically what they produced in the valley, and what they mostly produced were dairy foods. But not like the dairy foods we have today. They had spring-calving cows, and they would turn them out on the pastures. As soon as the ice and snow went, they would turn them out on these alpine pastures that were full of all the things I've just mentioned. And they considered their butter and their milk and their cheeses to be extremely healthy. And they lived to a great age, those people, even though their diets were very high in saturated fats and very high in dairy products, but they were produced that way. Anyway, Western Price went to all these peoples, he took samples of their food, photographed, took samples of their diet, took all the foods back to his laboratory in America, and analysed them all for the nutrients that were known about at the time, which was the 1930s. I hadn't even discovered all of them. I didn't know about things like CLA or even all the vitamins. But anyway, he analysed them all, and he found, he came to some remarkable conclusions. They were all very different diets. There were people who had access to seafood. He went to an island in the Hebrides where they had a lot of seafood and oatmeal. But he analysed all these diets, and he found that they had certain things in common. They were all high in animal foods, animal fats, high in saturated fats. But he found that, on average, their content of water-soluble vitamins, that's things like vitamin C, were 4 times higher than the American diet of his day. I mean, that was in the 1930s. They'd probably be about 10 times higher now. Fat-soluble vitamins, they were 10 times higher than the average American diet of his day. And I should have added that all these people that he went to were all in very good health. They often lived in very harsh climates, and that's not to say that, some of them didn't have high death rates, but they tended to be from accidents. He could find no sign of degenerative disease of any kind. And he wrote a book which came out during the war, early 1940s, and it was called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And all his findings were in there. And basically his claim was that we needed to eat the unprocessed, natural foods of the countryside, if you like, to stay healthy. But it was launched, two things were happening when his book came out. They were just discovering antibiotics, and the medical profession was fixated on the idea that drugs were going to be the way to health. These new magic bullets were going to be the way to health, and this dentist coming along and saying, no, that isn't the way. Proper food is the way to do it. Nobody took any notice. Anyway, his book sank, and of course things were happening in agriculture. We had all these factories making explosives that were being converted to nitrate fertilizer. It's the foundation of this kind of our present agricultural system. So, but Sally Fallon, who's a nutritionist, we discovered his work about 10 years ago and founded this foundation. I do advise you to look at their website. If you have any interest in nutrition at all, it's all scientifically referenced. You can find all kinds of amazing stuff there about, for example, what's the healthy fat. And you'll be amazed to find that the only safe fats to cook in are animal fats, basically. The only plant fat that is safe to heat up and cook in is coconut oil. And all these polyunsaturated oils we're told are so healthy, they are, when they're part of the package that nature gave us, like seeds, they're very unstable. As soon as you heat them up, as soon as you process them, like when you buy these bottles of vegetable oils in the supermarkets, they look so pure and nice. They've been so highly processed and heated, they're actually very dangerous. They produce all kinds of toxins, which cause all kinds of damage to the body, and free radicals and all that. So it's worth having a look at just what she writes about fat. As I say, it's all scientifically referenced, and it's almost got to the point now, well, yeah, that was work done sort of 40 years ago, but now in the last 10 years, science has kind of caught up with it, and there have been lots of books out lately challenging the whole idea that saturated fat causes heart disease. There was one that came out a couple of years ago by a chap called Richard Tobes, an American science writer, who wrote a book called The Diet Delusion. He went through every single piece of evidence that went into the theory that saturated fat is the cause of heart disease. And he found it all wanting, and his conclusion was that fat, no kind of fat actually causes heart disease or any other kind of degenerative disease. A much more likely candidate is actually processed carbohydrate, refined carbohydrates, particularly sugar and white flour. And just to come right up to date, there's someone I've met and filmed in the last week for our Pasture TV. Is a woman called Natasha Campbell-McBride. She's got some books out, some of you may know them. She's a Russian neuroscientist. She was a neurosurgeon. She came to Britain, she married a Scot, that's why she's in Britain, and she came to Britain to start a family, and she had two sons, one of whom was challenged, shall we say, in the autism spectrum. Not to say he was autistic, but there were all kinds of problems. She became, unlike most doctors, she became very interested in nutrition, took another degree in nutrition at Sheffield University. And she now runs something called the Cambridge Nutrition Clinic. And she treats children and adults, but it's principally children with